It is a distinct honor for me to introduce our next keynote speaker of the morning, Ambassador G. Philip Hughes. Ambassador Hughes has held several notable positions throughout his career, including Assistant Analyst for the Congressional Budget Office, Research Fellow at the Brookings Institution, Assistant Director for Intelligence Policy of the Office of the Secretary of Defense, Deputy Assistant to the Vice President for National Security Affairs, Director for Latin American Affairs for the National Security Council, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Political and Military Affairs, and Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Export Enforcement. From 1990 until 1993, he served as the U.S. Ambassador to Barbados, Dominica, St. Lucia, Antigua, St. Vincent, and St. Christopher-Nevis-Anguilla. At Manchester Trade, Ambassador Hughes advised business associations and corporate clients on trade and international business issues. His other private sector roles have included Executive Director of the National Council of World Affairs Organizations and Managing Director of the Council of the Americas. Ambassador Hughes currently serves as Senior Director of the White House Writers Group, Secretary of the Council of American Ambassadors, and is a member of the Center for Strategic and International Studies here in Washington, D.C. The lecture topic that he's chosen today is Cultural Diplomacy as Strategy. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving a very, very warm welcome to Ambassador G. Philip Hughes. Thank you.
Thanks very much, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to the symposium today. With all that varied background, you might wonder what exactly it is that I know about public diplomacy, since none of those titles actually pertained directly to public diplomacy. But in the Reagan administration, a great deal of emphasis was laid on public diplomacy, probably more than at any time I can remember in the executive branch, even after our efforts pre and post 9/11 to deal with problems of perception and misperception in the Arab and Muslim world. So you couldn't be in the Reagan White House without, and in the national security field, without being in one way or another involved in and engaged in our public diplomacy initiatives, and I had the privilege of being involved in a number of them. I gave this talk a title, Cultural Diplomacy as Strategy, as an outgrowth of two vignettes, one a year ago, one a week ago. A year ago, I had the opportunity to mentor a brilliant young woman as an Annenberg Summer Fellow of the Council of American Ambassadors. This girl was so brilliant, she had a better than 4.0 grade point average from her university. But she was also a concert violinist, a musician, and training simultaneously in political science and music. That appealed to me. I have something of a musical background myself. So I was her mentor for the summer, and in the course of our exchanges, it developed that she was passionately interested in pursuing cultural diplomacy as a career. We talked a lot about that. But it also dawned on me as we exchanged about cultural diplomacy that she didn't really have a very clear idea about what this involved. To her, and not to stint in any way her intellectual brilliance, which was prodigious, it sounded like a fairly interesting way to have the government pay her to play her musical instrument in fairly interesting places around the world for a larger cause than just entertainment. Okay. Well, that's sort of a way of looking at cultural diplomacy for beginners. Last week, I was introducing the Council of American Ambassadors' recent Davis Fellow in Public Diplomacy to a longtime colleague from the White House who runs one of the institutions here in Washington that's most intellectually invested in public diplomacy. That is a self-standing graduate school of international affairs called the Institute for World Politics here on 16th Street. We were talking about the field of public diplomacy writ large, and my colleague across the table, drawing on some observations from his recently published book on the subject, just sort of touched on cultural diplomacy in passing and mentioned cultural diplomacy as, well, that's the most key and in many ways the most strategic aspect of public diplomacy. What a juxtaposition. Brilliant young academic cum violinist who thinks about this, perhaps as a young person, as a way to get the government to pay you to play your musical instrument abroad for audiences with a larger purpose, and a professional who sees this as the most strategic of all the areas of practice in public diplomacy. Quite a contrast. What I want to do this morning is to explore the connection between cultural diplomacies, between cultural diplomacy and strategy. I'm not sure that that connection is second nature even to cultural diplomacy's advocates and practitioners. But first, let's define terms. Public diplomacy has been pretty ubiquitously discussed for at least 3 decades now, but there can still be a lot of confusion about what we mean and where the lines are drawn between different activities. By cultural diplomacy, I mean those activities that are conducted, sponsored, or promoted and encouraged by the government that present or portray American culture in its many different facets to audiences abroad, with the intent of fostering a deeper understanding and appreciation of our culture, and of fostering friendly, benign regard for the United States among foreign publics. So it's not educational exchange, although educational exchange programs can have some of the same effects. And it's not information programs or counter-propaganda. And its target is almost always foreign publics. Only very indirectly, in my conception anyway, is cultural diplomacy aimed to have an effect on foreign government leaders and their policies. And when it does, at least again to my understanding, it provides a sort of, I didn't know that, background appreciation that can add extra dimensions and a greater degree of sort of non-specific sympathy for the United States among foreign leaders. In a world of exponentially increasing communication and information availability, cultural diplomacy can be critical in shaping the perception of the U.S. overseas. But it's also the branch of public diplomacy, I think, that is most susceptible to misfiring or even backfiring when it's not approached strategically, hence the importance of strategy. What are some of the ways that cultural diplomacy can misfire or backfire? Back to the beginning. The easiest way is probably that unfocused. It simply becomes a public subvention for visual and performing artists, writers, and musicians to display their arts and talents in exotic foreign venues at someone else's, generally the taxpayer's, expense. Now, there's certainly nothing wrong with America's cornucopia of creative artists of all types displaying their creativity to public audiences abroad and potential customers, collectors, and patrons around the world. But it only becomes a worthwhile government expense when there's a strategic purpose being advanced with a particular target audience. At least that's my sort of, stingy Republican point of view. More problematically, cultural diplomacy can degenerate into a contest for official patronage of just about anything avant-garde for overseas exhibition. Now, properly and strategically placed, this too can be an asset. For example, in the sophisticated capitals of Europe or of Asia, which have either long been or have more recently become havens for precisely that kind of artistic and cultural expression. But misplaced abroad, in the wrong cultural context or milieu, this sort of, subsidized avant-garde patronage can reinforce religiously based or traditionally rooted prejudices and stereotypes about the U.S. that it should be the whole object of cultural diplomacy to counter. So what does a strategic approach to cultural diplomacy look like? What does it require? I'm going to outline about 5 things. First and foremost, it requires research. That's the starting point, after all, for any effective public relations or public affairs program. We were just actually in a meeting last week about this time with a leading public relations firm worldwide here in town that just happens to be considering buying our firm. And what did they lead with? Their research. When they talked about their key captures of new business, what did they say? We went in having done some research, researching a couple of key questions. What could we research in 24 hours by asking questions of an audience via the internet? And the results of our research wowed our customers, and that's how we got the bid. If it starts that way in commerce, it starts that way in this business too. What are the prevailing attitudes and understandings of U.S. society and its culture in the given target society and population abroad? What stereotypes and prejudices do we need to overcome to achieve a fuller, truer picture of American culture? How are these attitudes striated within a given overseas society's population, among its social classes, or its regional and ethnic divisions? To whom, really, abroad, do we need to be addressing ourselves, and emphasizing which themes? Old USIA, the U.S. Information Agency, housed a formidable research capability in this area, one that could not only help focus and inform its programs, but whose feedback was often factored in as one component of at least Reagan administration national security decision-making on particular issues. What is USIA telling us about attitudes abroad? For example, in Europe, during the very controversial INF missile deployment debate and INF treaty negotiation with the Russians. In fact, that research capability enabled us, somewhat mystifyingly, to reach populations in areas of the world that were then more strongly denied to us than any area of the world is denied to us now for outreach or research. So that was really quite remarkable. I'm not certain whether the State Department has maintained or even improved on this capability in the dozen or so years that it's been the steward of our public diplomacy efforts. It requires a close look. Second, a strategic approach to cultural diplomacy requires clarity. What exactly are we trying to convey about U.S. culture with a given sponsored or promoted cultural activity or campaign? If the stereotype is one of Philistine commercialism, is that likely to be countered or reinforced by a pop music band tour? If the stereotype is of a godless, hedonistic, materialistic society, is this likely to be offset by a wave of avant-garde art exhibitions, fashion galas, or consumer technology expos? We used to say that USIA's mission was telling America's story to the world. But that begged an important question. What story? Or perhaps better, which story? From a cultural standpoint, the United States is, in a certain way, rather like the Bible. It's big enough that if you look hard enough, you can find just about anything you're looking for in there somewhere. The cultural diplomacy challenge has always been artfully, strategically, selecting those bits that tell the right story to a particular people or audience overseas. Layered on this, and further complicating the picture for the contemporary world, is the additional challenge of selecting which of several competing narratives of the American experience should be relevant for what we share of our culture, where and how, in order to shape public attitudes abroad. If there were consensus on this American narrative, as in previous eras, let me say that again. If there was consensus of the past on those various narratives, there certainly isn't consensus now. And the result of that dissensus on what is the American narrative can be problematic. I'll tell you a story from my own little post in Barbados. When I arrived, we had a number of black officers. Some I had recruited specially, some were already there, some I recruited after arriving. But a particular officer in charge of our information programs was there, and it was her job to tell America's story to the world. But in Barbados, and in the islands of the Eastern Caribbean, there were very stereotypic attitudes, to my way of thinking, about race relations in this country. It was a narrative of prejudice, and a narrative of prejudice about an iniquitous society. In popular conception, it gave little credit for the amount of progress the United States had recorded in a single generation in tearing down barriers to opportunity and establishing legal and de facto equality for many citizens who for generations had been previously discriminated against. But our information programs didn't make that clear. In fact, they tended to reinforce the stereotypes and narrative that was, for some psychologically reassuring purposes, adopted locally. And that just didn't serve the purpose. So we changed that. That's what I mean about telling America's story to the world. A strategic approach to cultural diplomacy is also cognizant. That is to say, it has to be conducted with awareness that all around it and providing the surrounding context is this vibrant American society and economy that's creating and conducting its own sort of unofficial, indeed largely unplanned and definitely not orchestrated, cultural diplomacy. What I mean is, there's this profusion of things American, from movies to McDonald's and Jeeps to jeans, from iPhones and iPods to hip-hop and rap, that America's economy and industry and Americans traveling and studying and working abroad are creating as an ever-present, you might say even omnipresent, representation of many facets of our commercial and colloquial society. People abroad can't miss this. Much of this is positive. Witness the commercial success and near universal appeal of America's offerings in the marketplace. Some of it is pedestrian, vulgar, or worse, and the frequent target of everything from complaints about America's crass and vapid commercialism to, on the extreme other hand, jihad abroad. All of it, however, is unavoidable. It is going to happen. Indeed, it is happening, and it has been for over 6 decades, so there is no unringing that bell or turning back that clock. So a strategic approach to cultural diplomacy has to depart from that recognition. Given limited resources, and the fact that it's not essentially a self-sustaining commercial export, our cultural diplomacy has to have as its aim, it obviously can't be to sweep back the sea of other impressions left by the profusion of American commerce and travel in the world. Rather, I think, and I'm not sure I definitely know that I don't have the alchemy formula for what I'm about to suggest, but I think this is the direction one needs to look in to do this effectively. I think we need to conceive of our cultural diplomacy offerings as like drops of concentrated dye that when dropped into a pool of water don't change its essential chemistry, but they do change its color. Or maybe more aptly, we should be looking for the equivalent of a sort of chemical additive when dropped in tiny quantities into a pool of cloudy water, diffuses, binds with the precipitants in the water, and causes them to settle out so that the pool becomes clear and appealing. A strategic approach to cultural diplomacy is, I think, also confident. This is tough, especially in today's milieu, where one man's confidence is another man's arrogance. We're in an environment in which we're so anxious not to be projecting arrogance, and in which the president, no less, has made a habit of apologizing for past supposed American arrogance, that we have trouble finding the line between confidence and arrogance. The problem's only been further compounded by the legacy of impressions left by the George W. Bush administration. But conveying the value and the values of a culture requires a considerable measure of confidence in its values and in its value. I believe that we increasingly will recover our confidence once we recover both from the current rather confidence-rattling recession, and from the forces that are keeping us mired in it. But if we can't recover our confidence, we'd better become much better at faking it, because no one will buy something that the seller himself doesn't believe in. One final reflection on cultural diplomacy, and then we'll have time for questions. And this is a focus, a reflection on why it needs to be strategically targeted to be effective. Unlike other branches of public diplomacy, cultural diplomacy is not, to my understanding, intent on supplanting anything. Unlike counter-propaganda or information programs, it's not aiming to replace lies or errors and mistakes with facts and truth. Unlike educational programs and exchanges, it's not aiming exactly to fill a void of ignorance with knowledge and understanding. And it's certainly not aiming to supplant some other nation's people or culture with our own. It is not, in short, some form of cultural imperialism. That's what's usually ascribed to the commercial outpouring of American stuff that I was talking about a few minutes ago. Rather, cultural diplomacy, properly understood and executed, is simply aimed at portraying the richness and diversity of American culture, and particularly those strategically selected facets of that complex reality that will best counter negative, locally held stereotypes and misconceptions, so that it will be better and more completely appreciated. And if it's successful, so will we, as a people, as a nation, and to a much more limited degree and in a much more indirect way, as a government. But while effective, that is to say strategic, cultural diplomacy isn't nearly so subversive as putting the lie to the propaganda of an antagonistic regime that in turn depends on lies for its sustenance. It can have, that cultural diplomacy, a largely unintended but more deeply subversive effect, particularly for societies that are suffering from repressive governments. Let's face it, American society is infectious. So are its values of personal freedom and choice, of individual opportunity and inclusiveness, of tolerance and mutual respect. When these values are effectively portrayed and conveyed through the vehicles of effective cultural diplomacy, they catch on, or they help inspire those abroad who have already caught on. And that, as we see among Iran's youth today, as we've seen in country after country during the Arab Spring, as we saw in Tiananmen Square 13 years ago, can be subtly and profoundly subversive for authoritarian, repressive regimes. And so back to the beginning. Within our public diplomacy arsenal, cultural diplomacy may look like the most benign and least dangerous weapon, especially as it doesn't aim perceptibly, it's not aimed perceptibly against the policies and practices of other governments and societies. But on closer inspection, it turns out, just as my friend from IWP suggested, to be more powerful and potent. That's why we need to be careful, that is, strategic, not so much about where we deploy it, but about how we aim and target it. Thanks very much. I'm happy to take your questions. Are there any?
Thank you very much, Ambassador Hughes, for a very thought-provoking lecture, which I think in many ways moved us in a similar direction as our previous presentations. We welcome your questions or your comments. Please. Yes, and if, as always, you could briefly introduce yourself and stand. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Thomas Cotter. I'm a student at Old Dominion University. First of all, thank you, Ambassador Hughes, for coming out and speaking to us today. Secondly, my question for you is, what is cultural diplomacy's role in developing strategy for Central and South American immigration, and where would that begin?
Oh, that's a very interesting and tough problem because it's so fraught domestically. I mean, I think my sense is that I really haven't thought about this, so this is like totally off the top of my head. My sense is, it's very topical given the Supreme Court's decision in the Arizona law yesterday, is that while this is a subject that's eminently susceptible to information policy programs, both clarifying our laws to foreign audiences and the manifesting and underscoring the nature, the immigrant nature of American society. And its traditionally, generally welcoming approach to foreigners. I mean, there have been times, as you know from our economic history, when we've clamped down sharply, for example, in the late 19th century on immigration from Asia after we've gone through some bouts of that. But by and large, this country, like a few other countries in the Western Hemisphere, have been built on immigrants, and our approach has been generally welcoming. Where does cultural diplomacy fit in that? As I say, haven't thought about it very much, but it strikes me that through the manifestation to foreign audiences, particularly in this hemisphere, of the multicultural aspect of American society, particularly those from Hispanic backgrounds who are either contributing culturally, musical groups, performing artists, plastic artists, etc., or who are succeeding brilliantly economically, you can, if you deploy these assets properly, begin to at least chip away at the impression left by our domestic debate, and I don't think you're going to change that domestic debate or resolve it very quickly. You can at least chip away at or alloy the impression that there's, you know, a virulent anti-immigrant strain to American society by showing off, if you would, showing off those who've succeeded here brilliantly from as transplants from other cultures, and particularly from Latin culture. That's the closest to an answer off the top of my head I can offer you. Yes, sir.
Okay.
Good morning or good afternoon, bonjour, bon après-midi. That is cultural diplomacy. My name is Zeke Gbotokuma. I am an associate professor of philosophy at Morgan State University in Baltimore, Maryland. Morgan State University.
Okay.
And newly naturalized U.S. citizen. Several days ago, or years, or months, I went to an hotel, checked in, gave my name, Zeke, and somebody said, huh? And I said, Zeke Gbotokuma. The last one was more difficult to say, to pronounce. And the person asked me, where are you from originally? And I said, I'm from here. I'm an American. I said, no, you cannot be an American. That was not only because of my exotic name or my exotic accent, but also because, and I would say more specifically because of my name, Gbotokuma. American culture is rich and, as you said, diverse. It's Congolese, as in my case. It's Mexican. It's Italian. It's German, etc., etc. Now, when we engage in cultural diplomacy abroad, what kind of American culture are we supposed to promote for it to be American, given the diversity of this country?
That's a great point and a great question. When you were telling the story of your name, what flashed through my mind were the tales of many immigrants from Europe, for example, passing through Ellis Island in the 19th century, who on arriving here, especially from Eastern Europe with complicated names in Czech or Polish or Slavic names, either had the indignity of immigration officers assigning them names in documents that sounded roughly like what they said according to the immigration officers' ears, or deliberately simplified their names or anglicized their names in order to better get along. In my own case, I happened to have a dear teacher of Spanish when I was in school. He was a Cuban refugee, and he had a rather aristocratic name, Luis Antonio Casildo de la Moneda. He taught at Chaminade Catholic High School and eventually at the Marianist University in my town, also run by the same order, the high school and the college. By the time he was nationalized, he was Tony Casey. He was naturalized. So the name thing has been with us for a long time. It transcends continents, it transcends cultures, it transcends backgrounds, and different people have responded to it in different ways. Tony, I knew him as Professor Mr. Casey, or he solved the problem himself. That's what he decided to do, because Antonio Luis Casildo de la Moneda was just plain too complicated. What American culture are we to represent? The short answer, I think, is that for some purposes, there is what you might call sort of garden variety Midwestern American culture. You can find it in commercialized expressions, in cuisine, at least from sort of the South and the Midwest, in places like Cracker Barrel, although that's rather pedestrian, and you know, in things that are vernacular in the center of our country. And it's not so much, it's not specifically ethnic. It combines a number of ethnic elements from the distant past into a homogenized thing that's by now accepted as kind of American. But then there's that other complicated reality of America, and that is what we were talking about. You know, it's like the Bible. It's so big, and there's so much stuff in there. If you look hard enough, you can find pretty much anything that you're looking for. And in this case, we have a vibrant, ethnically based, multicultural, if you would, society that has all these different elements. So, you know, I think for certain purposes, in terms of sharing cultural diplomacy, highlighting to certain audiences the not native Afro-American, but the immigrant Afro-American dimensions of U.S. culture that are currents that are to be found in U.S. culture has a real dividend to play and a real message to send. For other purposes, it's the native Afro-American culture of jazz and so forth. For still other purposes, it may be the American Indian culture. I think you need to think about this as a sort of, you could say smorgasbord, but I'd rather think about it as a painter's palette of different, if you would, colors. And I don't mean that in any sense racially, I mean in the sense of painting a picture. There is a wide array. We're not just painting in primary colors here. We have a very, very wide palette of colors here from which to select to paint the portrait of America that will best resonate with an audience abroad and create what I think in cultural diplomacy one wants, which is a sympathetic response. We should use all of the colors on that very rich palette.
To follow up on the palette idea, I struggle with this very often as an American living abroad, too. I've been living 12 years now in Germany, and there's this famous impression, America is a melting pot. But when you think about it, a melting pot is actually a very boring analogy, in the sense everything melts together into this boring gray soup. Is that really American identity? So I always counter it by saying American identity is a mixed salad, where a carrot is a carrot and olive is an olive. It maintains its uniqueness, but it's actually a part of this greater whole. So in that sense, I think that's the balance sometimes that we have to try to achieve in terms of showing the diversity that America is. We do have a common history, very much linked to immigration, both by choice in the case of many immigrants, or non by choice in the case of slaves. And I think that immigration past definitely is sort of a basis for the salad or the salad bowl, so to speak. But the diversity is really what does make America in many ways quite unique. Unfortunately,
It's my
We're out of
time.
time,
I
so
have
I do
to
need
go,
to actually
and John
ask.
Maisto is here to be with you.
Before we let you leave the podium, I'd like to ask everyone to please help me in expressing our sincere gratitude once again to His Excellency Ambassador Hughes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mark, it's a pleasure. Thank you so much. Take care. Bye-bye.
No, thank you very, very much. We really appreciated your lecture and also at least a few questions that we're able to include afterwards.